Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Andy, for the hospitality and the invitation. This is my first trip to SLO. It's fantastic. I kind of hate to break up the party. You were all having a lot of fun. Now you got to come listen to me. So I have kind of a weird background to do this. So I'm a faculty member at the University of Washington, but I had a first career in finance. I was an investment banker and private equity investor. And so I did that for about 17 or 18 years and was turning 40. And my wife would say I had a midlife crisis, and I quit and got my PhD in public policy, and now I study housing and homelessness. And so when people say, like, well, why did you make this pivot? That's a long story. I won't bore you with that. But they're like, why do you study housing? And my answer to that, I give one of two answers depending on my mood. When I'm feeling maybe a little more benevolent, I will say housing is fundamental. If we think about Maslow, if we go back to high school health class, Maslow's hierarchy, basic needs need to be met before we achieve self-actualization. So when I went to graduate school, I started graduate school in 2012. Everyone was studying education, healthcare, social policy, poverty. That's what everyone was studying. No one was studying housing. And I was like, I kind of feel like this is pretty important. It was a very niche-y thing, and in fact, I had advisors say, like, you can't just study housing because you'll never get a job, right? You need to be broader than that. It was kind of interesting. And so what I say to folks is, like, we have all these outcomes in society that we care about, education, for example. So if we want our kids to learn geometry, let's make sure that kid's housed. Then we can worry about geometry. If we want an elder to be healthy, we care about healthcare, let's make sure that elder's housed. Because trying to fix those things without housing is really, really difficult. So that's kind of what motivated me to study this. And then through serendipity, I ended up in Seattle, which, if you haven't been up there recently, we've got a massive housing and homelessness crisis, as you do up and down California. Basically from Seattle all the way down to LA, Portland, you name it, it's a disaster. And so I would kind of sit around, I'd get invited to meetings like you're all having, I'm sure, and I, as a newcomer, would just kind of sit quietly and listen. And I would kind of leave and go, I don't think we know what's going on. We know we have a problem, but beyond that, there was no agreement about what was driving this crisis. And as a result, and as someone who studies public policy, I was really concerned about that, because in my social circle, I would go to gatherings, and what did I hear? People would talk about how much their home was worth and how much they hate homelessness. And every day there was an article in the Seattle Times attributing the crisis to something else. And people understandably were walking around saying, what's going on? Like, we're spending this money, we have these programs, the problem's getting worse. Screw it, let's stop spending this money. And I said, no, stop, time out. So this book is, to a certain extent, a response to that. It was also a response to people lecturing me about the causes of homelessness at a party. And I would just smile, and my wife would like elbow me, like, don't get into it. All right, so I wrote the book. This is it. I will say, this is the least methodologically rigorous thing that I've done as a scholar. I actually wrote that in my tenure dossier at University of Washington. It's, to a certain extent, an indictment of our field, in the sense that the impact of this is far greater than anything else I've done, but a 10th grade stats student could run the stats in this book. I wrote this book with my parents in mind, who are college educated, but they're not social scientists, and I wanted this to be accessible to them. I kind of thought if I hit the mark with them, they read the New York Times, they're engaged, they're interested in the world, but I wanted it to be accessible to them. And I figure if I hit that mark, then hopefully other people would read it, and in fact they have. To my great surprise. And what's been most surprising is being invited to talk all over the country and all over the world about this book. And no one is more surprised about this than I am. And it's been kind of fun. I've met a lot of cool people. I've been able to visit cool places like this. That's all great. I'm getting to the point where it's starting to get really concerning, because I'm going to places you wouldn't expect. Last week I was in Missouri at, get this, the Margaritaville Resort at Lake of the Ozarks. I checked into my hotel here before I got here, and I will take this every day of the week. It was a water park in the Lake of the Ozarks. But anyway, so this was the state of Missouri's state conference for county commissioners and city council members, all that kind of stuff. And Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and I've been to Kansas 3 times, and this housing crisis is spreading throughout the country, which is really, really, we're kind of used to it on the West Coast. It's just we were living with it. They're not used to it. And so I've been spending a lot more time there than I thought. I was in Green Bay in January, which is, I don't recommend in January. But I was sitting with the mayor of Green Bay, and he was just telling me like how significant the housing challenges are in Green Bay. And you pull the stats, and it's like, yeah, this is a problem. And he's like, and we're starting to have homelessness. I was like, yeah, no kidding. So it's really, it's it's a challenging time in the United States. I've had a chance to get to know Sean Donovan, who, for those of you who study housing, he was HUD secretary under Obama. Sean is now CEO of Enterprise Community Partners, which is a huge affordable housing developer in the United States. And we were together in Atlanta at a conference and chatting, and he said, and this gave me goosebumps when he said it, but he said, he ran housing in New York City before he moved to the federal government. So I mean, he knows housing better than anyone in the United States. He said, I've never been more concerned about the state of housing in the United States than I am right now. And so when Sean Donovan says that, it's like, we should probably pay attention. And we aren't, unfortunately. Well, we are, but not to a sufficient degree in terms of our action. So, decided to write this book, and before I ever put one word on the page, and before I even met my co-author, the one thing that I was really wrestling with in my mind was, when we ask what causes homelessness, that's a really complicated question with a complicated answer. And there's not a simple answer. And so, I knew that I was going to be kind of looking at research, structurally speaking, what causes homelessness to be high in some places and all that kind of stuff. But then we have a lot of other ways of knowing what causes homelessness. One of the ways that we know about what causes homelessness is we ask people who've experienced homelessness, why are you homeless? Right? Which seems to make sense. They know a heck of a lot better than I do. I've never had that experience. And so when we ask these questions, what we get, and I know there are people in this room who are working with people who are unstably housed all the time, you get really blunt answers. Right? My boyfriend beat me up and I ran, now I'm homeless. Okay. Right? I got in a fight with my roommate, she kicked me out, and here I am. Okay? I made some poor decisions, I drink too much, I lost my job, etc., etc., etc. And we honor these explanations as the truth, because they're absolutely the truth. What's frustrating, though, is the Seattle Times gets a hold of this and then says divorce is the cause of homelessness. And I'm like, if divorce is the cause of homelessness, we should have a lot more homelessness. Right? And my wife and I are empty nesters now, so she travels around with me. She couldn't come, she really wanted to come to this one. But one of the things I say, and she's like, would you stop talking about us getting divorced? But my point is, like, if Jen and I got divorced tomorrow, which I hope doesn't happen, neither of us would experience homelessness tomorrow. Right? So the point is that the context in which all these things happen is really important. Okay? So the way that I tried to reconcile this, because I knew I might be standing up here in a blue sport coat and a white shirt talking about the housing market, and there might be a woman sitting in the audience saying, it's domestic violence. So how do we honor that in a way that we're not putting these explanations in competition with one another? And the way that we decided to do that was to draw a distinction between what we call root causes and precipitating events, both of which are true, and they interact to produce the crisis of homelessness. And the way that we decided to do this, and this is the one argument that my co-author and I had, he's super smart, Rhodes Scholar, too smart for his own good, I tell him. And I said I wanted to use this metaphor of musical chairs, and he said, I think it's a terrible idea, it's sophomoric. And I'm like, that's the point. And he has admitted that he was wrong, which makes me feel good, because I've heard more about this than anything else in the book. Okay. So, you know the game, 10 friends, 10 chairs. There's a leader, starts the music, pulls one chair out, we now have 9 chairs. Music stops, everyone scrambles for a chair. By definition, someone loses. In this case, it's Mike, who's on crutches after spraining his ankle. And so if we interviewed Mike after the game and said, Mike, why'd you lose the game? What would you say? I had a bad ankle. And everyone would nod and say, of course, that's why he lost the game. Okay? That caused him to lose the game. There's that word cause again. But if we ask a different question and say, why didn't Mike have a chair? It's because we didn't have 10 chairs. And when we don't have sufficient chairs, who's going to lose the game? People who are vulnerable. Okay? And then we see that person on the street, or we interview Mike after the game, and we attribute that circumstance with that vulnerability. I just saw Joe on 3rd Avenue in Seattle. There's a needle next to him. Of course he's homeless. He's addicted. Okay? And what we're missing in that simple analysis that everyone is guilty of is the structural deficit of housing that's creating the conditions that allow for homelessness to thrive in cities like Seattle and San Francisco and SLO. Okay. And what we end up doing is spending a disproportionate amount of time focusing on Joe's particular circumstances, and we then equate the entire crisis with that. Not to suggest that behavioral health isn't an important focus. Of course we need treatment. We have a moral obligation to do that. But if that's our sole focus, we will never end this. Right? We cannot have enough treatment beds. We cannot have large enough shelters to deal with this. Okay? So that's the purpose of the book. I've also learned in 3 years of this book being out is that people get really passionate and angry on this topic. Okay? So It is absolutely true that if at the individual level, if you're addicted, if you're mentally ill, if you're poor, you're more likely to experience homelessness. True statement. True statement. But we also know that people have those conditions in every jurisdiction in the United States. And we have massive variation in rates of homelessness. So we should want to understand what's going on. So the question we pose is a pretty simple question, which is simply, why do rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? Why does my city of Seattle have 5 times the homelessness of Chicago? Which is massive variation. It's not 20 or 30%, it's 5 times. And the reason we ask that question is because if we can provide a credible answer to that question, it should tell us something fundamental about the nature of the crisis. And therefore, as concerned citizens or policymakers or housing developers, whatever, we can say, we should probably focus on that a little bit, or in this case, a lot. Okay? But this is a challenge for people because the logical explanation for regional variation is if drugs, mental illness, and poverty cause homelessness at the individual level, if you have more people with those conditions in a city, you'll have more homelessness. Right? That logical argument would get an A in class. It makes perfect sense. It turns out it's not true. It hasn't stopped a lot of really important, powerful people from making that argument publicly over and over and over again. Okay? So this book is about cities, not about people. And it's not because people aren't important and don't deserve our dignity, but I think we end up spending a lot of time focusing on individuals and blaming individuals for the outcomes that they achieve in life. What I wanted to focus on in this book is like, what the heck is going on in LA, in San Francisco, in Seattle, in Boston, in New York, and DC? And our thesis is that tight housing markets accentuate individual vulnerabilities and produce homelessness at high levels. And these individual factors or vulnerabilities that get so much attention in the Seattle Times week after week after week are really sorting mechanisms. They're helping to identify the people who are most likely to lose housing when housing is scarce. In this vicious game of musical chairs that we have in your city and my city. Right? I tell people it's like playing musical chairs with Usain Bolt, if you remember Usain Bolt, Jamaican sprinter, fastest man in the world. He's going to win every time. The Amazon people in Seattle are going to win every time. I have a lot of friends who work at Amazon. Not one of them is experiencing homelessness. Okay, so if we're going to center a book around rates of homelessness being widely varied, I want to demonstrate that for you. This is a little washed out, I apologize. There's no test afterwards, I promise. The point here is that journalists, and with all due respect to journalists, mess this up a lot because you can't compare cities to counties when we're talking about homelessness. Okay? Because cities, all else equal, will have higher per capita rates of homelessness because homelessness congregates in the urban core. Counties, because they're including suburban locations, all else equal, will have lower rates. So what we do in our book, we have the 30 largest metro areas, and we break them out by cities. And so what you see with cities here is that, and this is based on 2019, New York, DC, San Francisco, and Boston are about 10 per capita per 1,000 people, rates of homelessness, and that's about 5 times Indianapolis. Okay. Huge variation. What I didn't realize until I ran this is that the relationship is the exact same when you go to counties. So you got LA County, Santa Clara, King County, which is my county, and Multnomah, which is Portland, is about 5 times Hillsborough, which is Tampa. So the purpose of the book is to explain that. We should want to know why some of these places have these levels. Your numbers, your county was right about here in 2019. You've actually come down a little bit, which is awesome. Okay? But you were in that problematic category when we wrote the book. You just weren't big enough to make it. I apologize. That might be a good thing. This is updated for in the last year. Basically, the story is the same. The numbers have gotten a little bit bigger in some places, but generally speaking, we still have the same problem. So the logic of the book is we're going to use real simple statistics. We're going to test, does an individual explanation for homelessness explain this regional variation conundrum? If it doesn't, we cross it off and we move to the next one. And we just work our way through the book doing that. Okay? So we're going to start with poverty because it's probably the most fundamental relationship with homelessness. Of course, poverty causes homelessness. Homelessness is a poverty problem. If you have limited financial resources, you're far more likely to experience homelessness. Okay? So does poverty explain this conundrum of Seattle having 5 times the homelessness of Chicago? And the answer to that question is no, it doesn't. Okay? This is rates of poverty. These are highly impoverished cities. This is low poverty cities. This is rates of homelessness. What you see is there's a statistical relationship, and it's in the opposite direction of what we'd expect. Places with really high poverty have lower rates of homelessness. Greg, you just said poverty causes homelessness. It does at the individual level. At the community level, homelessness thrives amidst affluence. The two richest cities in the United States are Seattle and San Francisco. And they have far higher rates of homelessness than our poorest cities, which are Detroit, Cleveland, and St. Louis. Okay? So homelessness thrives amidst affluence. This doesn't mean that poverty doesn't matter. What it means is being poor in an affluent place has really significant consequences. It's no picnic in Detroit, but it's a real big problem in San Francisco.
And it's slow.
Okay? And slow.
And it's slow.
Absolutely. All right. So the next individual attribute we want to talk about are drugs and mental illness. And this is when people's blood pressure starts to rise. So if you feel your blood pressure rising, you're in good company. I've only had one person, there was one woman I was in Boise, who got so mad that she started asking questions, they had to escort her out. Okay. Otherwise, it's usually just angry emails with 4-letter words that are not love, I'll tell you. Greg, how dare you suggest this isn't a drug problem? Okay, so this is rates of serious mental illness. In every state in the nation, the data for drugs and mental illness are better at the state level than at the community level. Every dot is one of our states in over 13 years, and what you'll see is there's basically no relationship at all. Okay. This doesn't mean that mental illness isn't part of the story here. Of course it is. The point is that the problem in California, Oregon, and Washington is not that we have more per capita people with serious mental illness. The consequences of mental illness might be different here. It's also true that our national and state responses to the mental health crisis have been woefully insufficient. Two things can be true at the same time. One is we need better treatment and more treatment, and this is not the core driver of the homelessness crisis in our jurisdictions. If it were, we would see lots more mental illness in states with really, really high rates of homelessness, and we don't. A related analysis is substance use disorders, and this is washed out, I apologize. This R squared of 0.06, for those of you who took stats at some point, means nothing. It's a nothing burger. Okay? People are using and abusing drugs in every state in the nation at varying rates, and that variation bears no relationship to rates of homelessness. Okay? This really irritates people. Okay. Again, of course, at the individual level, if you're addicted, you're far more likely to experience homelessness. But people are using drugs in every place. And when people get angry with me, I'm like, do you think people use drugs in Chicago? They do. And when people get really angry, I'll just say, let's talk about West Virginia, which is the home of the opioid epidemic in the United States. It's the highest overdose death rate in the United States. Absolute tragedy. One of the consequences of that whole phenomenon is not high rates of homelessness. If this were fundamentally driven by drugs, West Virginia, Tennessee, Mississippi should have massive rates of homelessness, and they don't. So again, this doesn't mean that people who are facing addiction don't deserve dignity and treatment. Of course. Of course. But if that's our only focus, we are going to miss a really, really big problem here, which is housing. All right, race. Does race help us understand regional variation? Black, brown, indigenous people are grossly overrepresented in the homeless population. Okay? So let's look at the racial makeup of cities and see if that explains this conundrum. And the answer to that question is no, it doesn't. Okay, well then how do we reconcile this? The way I reconcile this is race doesn't cause homelessness. Being black doesn't cause homelessness. If it did, Chicago would have more homelessness than Seattle. Seattle's a disproportionately white city. Higher black population in Chicago. They don't have more homelessness. In fact, they have less homelessness. So race doesn't cause homelessness, racism causes homelessness. So it's racism within existing structures that have been around for hundreds of years produce disproportionality. And that's true in Seattle, and SLO, in Jackson, Mississippi, and in Baltimore and Boston. That explains why people of color are overrepresented in every jurisdiction in the United States. It doesn't explain why Seattle has a lot more homelessness than Chicago. Okay? So we still don't have a good answer to the question. We're still hunting, okay? Everyone doing okay? Blood pressure okay? All right. Now we're going to get to the portion of the meeting that I refer to as kind of the cocktail party conversation, which happens at more frequently than I would like. Usually with me holding a glass of red wine and smiling. Greg, it's warm in LA, it's cold in Chicago, that's why they have more homelessness. Okay. Have you heard this one? Okay. So, when we count homelessness is January every year. We conduct a point in time count. So we can actually look at weather in January when we count homelessness. And what we see is there's literally no relationship whatsoever. Okay? What this simple analysis, and having lived in Chicago, it is true. LA is warmer than Chicago in January. But there are also places in Arizona and Texas and Florida that are quite warm and don't have the same problem with homelessness. And Boston is no picnic in January, if you've been there. And they have some of the highest rates of homelessness in the United States. Okay. So we'd love to blame Mother Nature because then we don't have to look in the mirror. Right? We'd love to find someone else to blame. We can't blame Mother Nature. Now, for those of you who are really astute, there may be some relationship between unsheltered homelessness and weather because West Coast jurisdictions have not built robust shelters as Boston, New York, and DC have. We talk about that in the book. I'm not going to get into that tonight, but it is true that the visible manifestation of homelessness might be more prevalent in warmer places. Okay? Greg, if we stopped being so generous, people wouldn't move here to experience homelessness. There's a fan out there. So I first heard this argument in Minneapolis. I was getting my PhD, and everyone was blaming folks from Chicago for homelessness in Minneapolis. So we studied it and found no evidence. I moved to Seattle literally in my first meeting. Someone said, you know, we're a magnet for homelessness. I said, well, that's funny. That's what Minneapolis said. So where are your people coming from? California. Like, okay. So then I come down here, and California says, well, you know, we're a magnet for homelessness. I was like, you can't be. You're sending your people to Seattle. They just told me. And then I said, well, where are your people coming from? Texas. Right? We love to blame Texas for lots of things. So Middletown, Ohio, we refer to them in our book. They think you're a magnet for homelessness. And with all due respect to Middletown, I'm sure it's a lovely place. I don't buy it. I don't think people are moving across the country to go to Middletown, Ohio. I just don't believe it. Okay? So I'm not a physicist, but this is not how magnets work. Right? There needs to be a recipient and a deliverer. Like, it just doesn't work. So it's a super prevalent argument. My friend and colleague Margot Kuchel, just up the road at University of California, San Francisco, published an amazing study of homelessness in California. Arguably, probably the most important piece of research we've had in the last 10 years. And they interviewed thousands of people. What did they find? 90% of the people experiencing homelessness in California are from California. Okay? So, is there an anecdote to the contrary? Of course. And might the LA Times find that person and interview them? Very likely. Okay? But we shouldn't make policy based on anecdote. This is a homegrown problem. We need to acknowledge that. The other problem is when you ask people questions, you have to be pretty specific. If the Seattle Times, if I was experiencing homelessness in Seattle, and they stopped me and said, where are you from? I would say, I'm from Minnesota. That's where I grew up. I lived there in adulthood. I think of myself as Minnesota. I've lived in Seattle for 8 years. If I experience homelessness tomorrow, it's not a mobility story, but they could certainly write a story saying there are people from Minnesota here experiencing homelessness. That's not the story. Okay? So the point is that it is very tempting because then we can blame someone else. We can blame another jurisdiction. The other reason why this doesn't hold up is it doesn't make logical sense. Mobility among low-income folks is actually pretty high. But it tends to be local mobility because they tend to be renters, leases are 1 year, and so we see a lot more residential mobility among low-income folks than high-income folks. As soon as you look at state-to-state mobility, it falls dramatically with income. Meaning, high-income folks move state to state far more than low-income folks because it's hard, it's expensive, disruptive, the whole 9 yards. I talk about our family. We moved a family of 4 to Seattle in 2017, and it sucked. It's not a scientific term, right? And we had every advantage under the sun. We had resources. I had a nice job waiting for me, but we didn't know anyone. We didn't have any friends. New schools for the kids. Had to find. Luckily, they were older than that. But yes, and it was really difficult. And so now imagine you're in Indianapolis saying, you know, I think I'm going to move to LA. I'm at the end of my rope, but my mom or uncle is the only one who's going to take care of my kids in Indianapolis. Am I going to leave? No, I'm not going to leave. So this is the most prevalent and least supported argument of any of these. Okay, it doesn't stop people from making these arguments. All right, politics. In Trump's first term, he and Governor Newsom got into a big spat. Trump said Democrats run West Coast cities, which is true. West Coast cities have lots of homelessness, also true. Therefore, 1 + 1 = 2. Governor Newsom wasn't a big fan of the argument. Right? And he said, well, this is the fault of the federal government who has stepped away from low-income housing policy for the last 40 years, which is a true statement. Both those arguments are not good on this particular topic. Okay? Democrats run basically every big city in the United States. So if Democrats were the cause of this, then Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago should have tons of homelessness. They don't. If federal retrenchment were the cause, Newsom's argument, then we shouldn't have massive variation. Everyone should be equally starved of resources and have the same problems. It's not to suggest there aren't threads of truth in all those. The point is that there's still something else going on. Okay? So we're still hunting for a good answer. All right, so now we're going to get to the housing market. As you may have suspected, this is where we're going to start to get a little more action. There are a lot of scary things about writing a book, but one of the most scary is that people can write book reviews. And they can write whatever they want. And so every time I see a book review come in my inbox, my heart starts to beat a little faster, like, oh boy. And there's a professor at Indiana University in Bloomington who wrote a book review. And he's a well-known housing scholar. And I was like, okay, here we go. And his opening sentence was awesome, which was, Gregg Colburn would be a terrible mystery writer. And so I sent him a note. I'd never met him. I said, you win the award for best opening line to a book review. So anyway, this should not be a surprise to anyone. The housing market really matters. This is median contract rents and rates of homelessness. And for those of you who can't see this or don't care about statistics, this is way more convincing than anything else we test in the book. Where rents are high, homelessness is high. Right? No one's giving us a Nobel Prize for this. Okay? But it's a heck of a lot more convincing than all the other nonsense that people are talking about at your cocktail parties. Okay? A related variable is your rental market vacancy rate. For those of you who've studied urban economics, you know that 5% is kind of a neutral point for a rental market. Below 5% would suggest that you have a deficit of rental housing. It's like the unemployment rate, you can never get to zero. Right? Because you leave your job, your chair's empty for a bit, and then we hire someone. So we always have some structural unemployment. We always have some structural vacancy in the housing market. Okay? When vacancies get below 5%, what happens? You see homelessness is higher. When you combine high rents and low vacancies, what you'll see is there's not a counterexample in the United States. There is not a place with high rents and low vacancies in the United States that doesn't have a problem with homelessness. So is this model that we put together perfect? Far from it. I would never suggest it is, but it's a heck of a lot better than anything else that I've seen from folks. It's a way more convincing explanation for why our coastal cities have this massive problem than all the other explanations that I've seen. Okay? So the point is if you buy the argument, we should probably really be thinking then about the cost of housing and the availability of housing if we want to address this issue. So why do places like SLO and Seattle and San Francisco have high rents and low vacancies? Is it because people are moving there? It's certainly part of the story. Amazon has blown up Seattle. San Francisco's tech boom was spread out over a longer period of time. Amazon's was like 10 years. 2010 to 2020, it literally blew up the city. So if you were to ask people who were generally inclined to buy my argument, they would generally blame Amazon for Seattle's problems. And there's some truth to that. But what's interesting is when you plot population growth, which is a proxy for housing demand, and rates of homelessness over the decade, or the 13 years in our study, there's no relationship. And this is the most surprising finding in the book for me. I remember I was watching a college football game running these numbers, and I was like, oh, I messed this up. I ran it 3 times. I was like, what's going on here? And so I started to go into these dots, and I realized, like, oh, there are a lot of places in the United States that are growing pretty fast. It's not just Boston and Seattle. It's places like Austin and Charlotte and Phoenix. But they're having very different experiences with the housing market. Why is that? Because we also need to think not only the demand for housing, as evidenced by population growth, but what's the supply? Are we building housing when people move there? And economists help us with this through this notion of supply elasticity. Again, you didn't come for an economics lecture, but you're going to get a real little one here. Okay? So elasticity is really important. What it basically says is when prices for a good changes, how much of that good is produced. So if the price of clickers goes up 10 times tonight, the people who manufacture these are going to probably have some champagne tonight because it's a really good thing for them. And then they're going to manufacture a bunch of these pretty quickly. 2 shifts, 3 shifts. Pretty soon we're going to see a lot of clickers on store shelves. Generally speaking, we would call this a very elastic good. because we can make supply quickly. If the price of housing in SLO goes up 10 times tonight, what's the supply impact in a week? 0. In 6 months, probably 0. The point is that housing is harder to build than this. And we also know that there are variations in supply elasticity, city to city, based on 2 factors. One is topography, and one is the regulatory environment. Okay? If you have mountains and water, it's harder to build more housing. You'll have a less elastic housing supply. And if you have a pretty strict regulatory environment, you're also going to have less elastic housing supply. If you combine those 2 things, really challenging topography and really strict regulatory environment, you will have a super inelastic housing supply. San Francisco, California. Okay? Probably as hard a place to build housing as anywhere in the United States, and mountains and water, which make it lovely and beautiful. And then you layer a tech boom on top of an inelastic housing supply, and what do you get? A disaster in the form of really high rents, low vacancies, and an associated problem with homelessness. So the problem in Seattle and San Francisco is tragic. It has had massive human and social consequences, and it's 100% predictable. And the frustrating thing for Seattle is that we watched San Francisco go through this, patted ourselves on the back, and said we're not San Francisco, and now we kind of are. Okay? So the lesson that I tell folks in the Midwest is I'm like the ghost of Christmas to come from Dickens' Christmas Carol. Like, don't repeat our mistakes. Like, learn from our mistakes. Don't wait until it's so bad that you act. And that's what's happening in Washington and California. We're acting now, which is great. We should have been acting 15 years ago. Okay? So if you're in Kansas or Kentucky or Indiana right now, act now. And that's hard. Making policy outside of times of crisis is a lot harder. It's a lot easier when you're in a pandemic or a recession or whatever to make policy. We do it all the time. Most of the major policies in the United States have come during wars, pandemics, or depressions or recessions. Because we're forced to. When we're not in that situation, we tend to not act. And so that's the key that we need to do, is we need to create more housing when we grow and prosper. Detroit has affordable housing. How did they get there? Industrial decline. No mayor's going to stand up and say, my vision for SLO is industrial decline, because then we'll have affordable housing. Right? No one wants to do that. So what we have to figure out is, I'm all for jobs, I'm all for prosperity, I'm all for growth, but we can't leave people behind in the process. And that's what's happened in every community in your state and my state. Okay. This is a visual depiction of that. If you think about change of population being a proxy for housing demand, and then supply elasticity being higher the number you build more housing, look at the Sun Belt. They grew just as fast as these cities, but they maintained really high or medium high rental vacancy rates by building a bunch of housing. I don't frequently find myself in the camp of advocating for Texas-style public policy. Okay? A lot of their housing growth was probably accomplished through sprawl, because it's flat as a pancake and it's a pretty easy regulatory environment. Not my preferred mode. But what it does tell you is that if you build the units, it has an impact. Right? I might prefer to go up rather than out, and that's a separate conversation in a separate book. But the point is that the units do matter. You can accommodate growth if you build more housing, which they did. Okay. I'm also not anti-regulation. I think regulation has an important role in society. I want my ground beef to be safe. Right? I want people to live in housing that's not going to collapse on them. But there is a reasonable middle ground between taking 7 years to build housing in San Francisco when people are dying in the streets. I firmly believe that. Okay? We have to find a more reasonable middle ground on that, in my opinion. Okay? And it doesn't mean throwing every regulation out the window, but it does mean saying, this is an acute need, we have to deal with this today. Okay? And that we have not done a good job with that. All sorts of political impediments in local neighborhoods, you know all this as well as I do. This is not easy. It's easy for me to just say it. It's a lot harder to do it in practice. All right, so what's happened since we published the book? Basically, the point is that the logic holds, but it's now holding in places like Phoenix and Travis County, which is Austin, Sacramento, Atlanta, Denver. These places are starting to exhibit housing market characteristics that look a lot like coastal cities, and their homelessness is going up. And then we still have our problem children, the big six on the coast. Problem is still pretty acute there. So what's going on here? This is your county, rental market vacancy rate, and then rents. 2020, this is from the American Community Survey. They don't do it in decennial years, which is why there's missing data here. Generally speaking, this is supercharging your rents in the decade of the 2010s. Rental vacancies of 2, 3, 4% are really, really unhealthy. And what happened? Zoom. I don't know what happened in 2019, why your vacancy went up so much. Sometimes in smaller communities like this, the numbers get a little wonky. So I don't know. Anyway, but you're back to where you were before. The red line is 5%. When you sit below 5% for an extended period of time, what's going to happen? Your rents are going to go bananas. Your rents are up 60% in 10 years, almost 5% per annum, year after year after year. Right? This is how Warren Buffett made a lot of money. You just compound at 7, 8%, and over 30 years, you're going to have either he's going to be a billionaire or your housing's going to be unaffordable. Okay? So what I tell folks is if your community is just living under this 5% threshold, you do not have enough rental housing. And you desperately need more rental housing, otherwise these rents are just going to keep going. You're now at basically $2,000 a month at the median, according to US Census. And that's 23, so you're over 2,000 now with 24 once those get released later this year. So how do we respond? The problem with building housing is it's a long-term solution. And so the mayor of Seattle says, I'm going to fix homelessness, and I'm going to follow Gregg's advice, and we're going to build housing, and in the interim, we're just going to have homelessness. That person will serve 1 term. Right? The pressure on local elected leaders is intense, and I understand that. And so what are we doing? We're wrestling with this at a national level. Last June, the Supreme Court gave a green light to criminalizing homelessness based on the Grants Pass case, Grants Pass, Oregon. In that case, which was tragic but fascinating to listen to the deliberations, I listened to all 3 hours, it was basically debating whether you could criminalize a basic human function like sleep. And so the justices literally were saying, like, well, sleep is a basic human function, yes. Right? And then we were going on and on. And ultimately, what did they do? They said, yes, we can criminalize. Okay? And your governor, soon after that, had a photo op, put his blue jeans on, and he was throwing people's stuff in a dumpster. And I don't have any, Gavin Newsom's fine, but the point is like, this is not just conservative red states that are now taking action that are pretty harsh. It's happening in your state and mine as well. Huge state level activity on criminalization. There are some well-funded groups that are working to get criminalization bills passed at the state level. One of them was in Oklahoma. I've created a Google alert for my name and the book's name just to see what's going on out there. I get alerts every day. It's kind of interesting. This one was something else. So this journalist is in Oklahoma. She interviewed the author of a criminalization bill in the Oklahoma State Legislature. I haven't met her. Apparently she had read our book. And she asked this legislator, do you think homelessness is a housing problem? His response is, it could be. I mean, it could be if they don't have a place to live. I sent this to Margot Kuchel, and she's like, we need to have t-shirts made of that, Gregg. Okay. So even people want to criminalize this, have to acknowledge, like, yeah, there is a housing story here. So to wrap up here, and then I'd be happy to listen to comments or questions that you have. What I frequently hear from folks is, Gregg, we've spent all this money on homelessness. It hasn't worked. Why would we keep spending this money? And that's a fair critique. Like, we want to be good stewards of our public funds. Whether you're a policymaker or a taxpayer, those are all legitimate questions. My pushback on that logic, there's kind of 2 sources of pushback. One is, the scale of our response to this crisis has been woefully insufficient to the scale of the problem. LA has been incredibly generous in terms of homelessness response. HHH was 1.2, 1.3, something like that, billion. A lot of money. Problem got a lot worse. So when I was at UCLA giving a lecture, people were complaining that didn't end homelessness. I was like, you got a $50 billion problem. And you threw $1 billion at it and it didn't end, and now you're pissed off. And I'm grateful for the billion. That billion saved lives. It probably created more housing, and LA is better for that billion than it would have been otherwise. But it was nowhere near sufficient to solve this problem. The other thing that's really important is that most of the money we spend in homelessness is a response to the crisis. We build shelter and other crisis response systems that are life-saving. And I'm grateful that we do that, and I'm exceedingly grateful for the people who do this work every day, some of whom are in this room. But then we blame that system for ongoing homelessness, which makes 0 sense. It's like blaming the ER doc for people breaking their arms. It's not my fault you broke your arm. I'm here to care for you now that you broke your arm. It's like, well, if the ER doc were better, people would stop breaking their arms. No, that's a terrible argument. And yet we blame the homeless response system for people still experiencing homelessness. It's like, no, I'm caring for Joe. Joe needs my help. right? What we have to do is think about our investments upstream in the sense that we have to create more housing that's affordable for more people such that fewer people are entering the system. Otherwise, our solution is going to be New York City 2.0, which is let's just build a bigger and bigger shelter system. New York shelters 95% of the people in that city. They will spend, in some cases, decades in the shelter system. Okay? They're off the streets, which is maybe better, but it's no picnic. I don't know if you haven't been to homeless shelters, it's not a terribly uplifting place, and I certainly want to raise my kids in that system. So, do we need a crisis response system? Yes. But if we really want to put a dent in this, we have got to invest upstream in housing, and particularly affordable housing. Otherwise, we'll just continue to be chasing this issue for a long time. This starts to get challenging. Those of you who are local elected leaders know what it's like to try to get multifamily housing built, or to change zoning, or to do all this stuff, right? People start to get, even people who are progressively minded start to behave in ways that we don't like a whole lot. So again, easier to say than to do, but ultimately we have to create more housing capacity or this problem will not go away. I have a fair question is who's going to fix this? Public sector, private sector? The answer is all the above. The answer to all these questions is all the above. We need short-term solutions, we need long-term solutions, we need the public sector, we need private sector. I told some folks earlier that I get accused of being a shill for corporate interests because I do believe it needs to be easier, cheaper, and faster for developers to build housing. And 95% of housing in the United States is unsubsidized. So if we have a deficit of 3 to 7 million housing units in the United States, which are the current estimates, a lot of that's going to be built by private developers. You may like that or hate that, and that's another topic. But that's who's going to build this housing, and it should be easier, cheaper, and faster to build that. Greg loves developers. I do, actually. We desperately need them. But to me, that's not shilling for developers. It's just saying we desperately need housing, and that's who's going to build it. At the same time, we also need to acknowledge that there are people who can't afford that housing. That's when I get called a socialist. Okay? That's not socialism, that's math. There are a lot of people who can't afford $2,000 a month in rent. It's not socialism. So the question is then, what is our societal response to that need? We probably need some support, either in terms of subsidies to developers to create more affordable housing, or rental assistance such that people can access that, or socially built housing, or whatever the case may be. But the current system doesn't work. And we have ample evidence just walking around and seeing that the system isn't working. Okay? If we want a different outcome for your community, for my community, is we have to do different things. If we continue to do the same damn thing, we're gonna get the same damn results. And that's certainly not good for any of us, and that's really not good for Joe, who's on the street. All right. My hope with this is that we take our attention off of Joe on the street. Not because he doesn't deserve dignity, respect, and care, because it's too easy for us to absolve ourselves of responsibility. I walk by Joe and say, boy, I feel bad for Joe, but he made some poor decisions in his life. I can go about my day. If instead I see Joe as a consequence of structures that I, Gregg Colburn, have contributed to throughout my life, it indicts me and it indicts all of us in this problem. And at night when I'm brushing my teeth, looking at myself in the mirror, then it says, well, what am I going to do? What are we collectively going to do? Right? This is a structural problem that requires structural solutions. Structural solutions are hard because they take political will and resources and all these things that seem to be in pretty short supply right now. Final point, and I want to leave on a positive note. Greg, I don't think this is going to work. Joe's a mess. I've had people say that exact sentence to me. And I'll say, you know why I'm confident that it will? Because we literally just did it. So one of the, there's a lot of unfortunate history in the United States. One of them is how we treated Vietnam vets, my dad's generation. Largely men, coming back from Vietnam, grossly overrepresented in the homeless population. Okay? Fast forward a generation, we send people to combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have men and women coming back, and to their credit, leaders in the federal government said we don't want to repeat that mistake. Republicans and Democrats said let's make sure that veterans don't experience homelessness as they did for the Vietnam generation. Fantastic. Okay? People say you're against housing veterans. My dad's a veteran, grandpa's a veteran. I'm all for it. What I'm not for is only housing certain people. Okay? What happened? We provided money through HUD and the VA, and we cut veteran homelessness by 55% in 10 years. And how we do it? Housing and services. Yet in the newspaper every day we hear people saying like housing first, housing and services doesn't work. BS, it does. We just did it. It is the only case of sustained investment by the federal government, and when we did it, we had massive results. So this idea that it doesn't work is folly. It's just we drew the line there. If we'd drawn the line in a different place and served other folks, we could have had the same result, but we didn't. So the ongoing failure for homelessness it's pretty clear, is that we just have not made the investments that we need to make. And we live with the results. And the problem is that ongoing failure then allows for these competing narratives to take hold, which is where we're at right now. So there's a policy making challenge, and then there's a PR challenge, and I think we're kind of losing the PR challenge, which is why I'm on the road every week. Fighting the fight, okay? So anyway, I wish you and your community well. This is a beautiful place. You want it to stay a beautiful place, and allow for people who have called this place home for generations to continue to live here. And that's the problem we have, is that in these beautiful places that people get priced out and then they're either displaced or are on the street or they have to move. And that's not my hope for your community, and I wish you well. Thank you for having me.
Wow, Greg, thank you so much. We got about time for maybe 15 minutes questions. 10, 15 maybe, official timekeeper. So you're a way better speaker than I am. I don't need to be up here monitoring this. I'll let you handle this.
All right, sounds good.
That was awesome, Greg.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
I have a microphone. If you have a question, now's the opportunity to me.
You mentioned earlier that you'd rather see cities built up rather than out, but you can appreciate that sprawl does sometimes have the propensity to build enough units. As a leader in this space, how do you manage advocating for places that might be healthier in terms of built form by building up versus just healthier in terms of getting enough units out?
Yeah, it's a good question. For those of you who are interested, there was a recent article in the New York Times basically making the case for sprawl. Connor Doherty, who's a Californian, he wrote the book Golden Gates, which is about housing in California. It's a really good read if you haven't read it, especially given that you live here. So he made the argument kind of making a case for sprawl, and he was absolutely destroyed in the comments, right? New York Times readers were not really happy with this. I know Connor, he's interviewed me. I really respect him. I don't think it was his best work. I don't think there are a lot of great arguments for sprawl. The one good argument being it's easier to build more housing. But I tend to, sometimes we end up in these fights where you get environmentalism and housing in conflict. And that's true. There are some environmental regulations that make housing more expensive. That's a true statement. Like we can just live with that conflict. But what I argue is that our shared interests are much more aligned than that, in the sense that going up is good environmental stewardship and it's a lot better for affordability. Right? We don't have people commuting for 2 hours, all that kind of stuff. And so I tend to not find myself advocating for sprawl. What I tend to argue for is, what I hear from people when we talk about going up is either Midtown Manhattan or Cabrini Green, public housing. I coached Little League Baseball in Cabrini Green in the 90s. This is how I got interested in housing, before those towers were torn down in Chicago. And I was like, no. Like, we're not looking to turn SLO into Midtown Manhattan. We can have gentle density in these cities that don't look anything like this. Seattle's zoned 75% single family, right? If we had 3 or 4 units on a lot of those parcels, we can create a lot more housing. And so it's really interesting that people immediately go to, when you say we're gonna go up, we're gonna build massive, no. But we can go up in a gentle way. This is where I think the design fields, and I'm in a college with designers. I'm not a designer at all. What I don't think we've done a very good job of is visualizing what gentle density can look like. Some of the coolest neighborhoods I've ever walked through, Boston, Philadelphia, are row houses, has gentle density, and it's like, I would love to live here, right? Trees, sidewalks, beautiful housing, it's dense. Yet people immediately say, I don't want my single family home to go because what's gonna happen? Well, what might happen is a really cool neighborhood like this. So I think that's part of it. We just have to educate what density means because we have these images in our mind that aren't realistic, in my opinion.
I'm going to, while you all think of your next question, I'm going to ask mine, which is that I would hear a lot of, we can't build our way out of this.
Yep.
So it feels like, yes, we can. Others are doing it. Maybe it's a design decision, but I feel like a lot of us in this room are wanting to have those back pocket responses. So we can't design it. We can't build our way out of this.
Yeah. There might be some truth to that in San Francisco and Seattle. And it depends on what it is. Building market rate housing will not end the homelessness crisis. It will help. We need a lot more units, and it'll make a lot of things easier if we have that, but that alone won't end this. We need subsidy and support. We need a lot more deeply affordable housing. So yes, building market rate housing alone won't fix this, but doing this without that housing will be next to impossible because there aren't places to put people. When we got emergency rental assistance during COVID in Seattle, I got a note from Seattle Housing Authority saying, like, we literally got a truck of money from DC and we can't use it because there was no place to put people. So the interventions that work are complicated when you don't have housing. Why aren't we scaling housing first in Seattle? Because we don't have housing. So there is some truth that we can't just build this out, and that is a critique to people who are just simply on the supply side just saying build, build, build. Get rid of all the regulations, we'll just build a bunch of housing, all problems will go away. I'm not in that camp. But I am in the camp of we should probably build a lot more housing and then think about what's the other side of the equation. We can do two things at the same time.
Thank you, that's helpful. Other questions?
So I grew up in Salt Lake City, and they had a pretty robust housing first program for a while.
Yep.
That was, I think, at one point in time really lauded for its success. But my understanding, and I don't follow this super closely, is that that hasn't been the continued case. And I guess my question is, other than really robust money from federal or state level,
Yep.
are there other policies that you think could be put in place that would help promote that housing first solution?
Yeah, so it's very hard to build housing, privately funded housing that's going to support people experiencing homelessness. The math doesn't work. And so ultimately without some subsidy, that's going to be really, really difficult. And so I frankly don't care how we get there. Public housing, social housing, vouchers, tax credits, whatever, that's what we need. And so yeah, it's a little bit of a downer, but yeah, I don't, without resources, we're not going to get there.
So predominantly a financial solution.
Well, it's a financial solution with a whole bunch of other stuff in there, but the money is a key input into that. Without being a total downer, the money exists to do this. It absolutely exists to do this. I mean, we did the math in Puget Sound in the book. McKinsey did a study basically saying to build 35,000 units of permanent supportive housing. Our homeless population is about 16,000 plus another 20 for people who are at risk. That's a lot of housing. That was going to cost pre-COVID $15 billion over 10 years. We don't have a state income tax. We could have a tiny income tax and pay for that in a heartbeat. And so when you look at the scale of state budgets, even in a constrained state like California, there is money around. And so, but yeah, there's one of the challenges we have is places that have had great success like Milwaukee and Houston have vacancy and low rents. And then they got money and they scaled housing first and had great success. And everyone says, well, why can't we do that? Well, we don't have housing, and the housing we do have is not cheap. And it's not to take away their good work. They did a lot of really good coordinated effort between public and private sectors. You had multiple mayors in a row who were on board, and that's why they had sustained success that Salt Lake didn't, because they were behind it. So fantastic success story, but they have a different context than we do. Yeah.
One of the things that I've been exploring, I live in Morro Bay, and, excuse me, my name is Dole Bay in Morro Bay, is I have 15 rental units. I have no children. I have no one to give the houses to. When I die, I would like to give them to the housing authority or people's self-help. But I have not really been encouraged to do this by either entities because it's an unusual request. But I think the private sector and people like myself, in my block also, two of the people that passed away gave their properties to gardeners. The Woods Humane Society gets 1 or 2 houses given to them every year, and they sell them, and then as soon as the old market housing goes to market rate, it becomes unaffordable.
Right.
And I don't hear that conversation where the private sector could be a solution also with everything else you talked about.
Right.
Have you heard of anything like this?
Well, do you have a land trust?
I do not, and as I say.
I mean, in the community? Because community
No,
land.
we do not.
Okay, because that's a great place to put that stuff, right? I mean,
That's something that needs to be explored
Yep.
and done.
Yep.
But anyway.
Right, so community land trust is one way to do that, to assemble land or in some cases already housing, and then you can hold affordability and perpetuity, all that kind of stuff. That's one mechanism. The housing authorities are tough because of all the federal regulations. I understand why they'd love to take it, I guarantee it, but it's hard for them to do that.
So where do we go?
Yeah, well, you could create a land trust.
Well, I know, I could myself.
No, but your community could, right? You could have a city or county land trust, right? And you start to fund it, and then whatever. So anyway, there are things to be done. That shouldn't be. What's that? Oh, hey!
I'm Jill Bolster-White, and I work for Transitions Mental Health Association,
Yep.
and we are happy to accept.
Awesome.
Yeah, anyone who has extra housing, we are free.
All right. Well, we got a deal done here.
Any other last questions before we wrap up our night here? All right. Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Amazing conversation. Please give yourself
Thank you.